there is no leadership at the federal level in the United States. The closest thing is a kind of reactivity to the threat of China, and that is not a strategy. It's not even a set of tactics. It's basically just a disposition.
China is building financial plumbing to accomplish their strategic objectives. And just like in other domains, the way that they've tried to build their power has gone through three general phases. Essentially, it's block, then build, and then expand. And so this is the logic they follow in the military domain. They carry this over into the financial domain. So the first is try to just block the ability of the West and the U.S. specifically to geoeconomically coerce them so much, right? So on that foundation of the strong bilateral trade, trying to expand their financial links and decreasing the ability of the West to coerce them through their dependency on dollar clearing.
What's up, Sats fans? Welcome to Swan Signal. I'm your host, Sam Callahan. I'm the lead analyst at Swan Bitcoin, and we have another great episode lined up for you guys today.
If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today.
We got two fellows from the Bitcoin Policy Institute. We got Natalie Smolenski, who's also the executive director and founder of the Texas Bitcoin Foundation. And then we also have Matt Pines, who's the director of intelligence at Krebs Stamos Group. So welcome to you both. I know we all just got back from Miami, so probably feeling a little bit tired, but thanks for coming on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so let's start off talking about the conference. I had an excellent time there. I mean, met so many great Bitcoiners, had so many great conversations. What were some of your favorite takeaways from the weekend? Let's throw it to Matt.
Well, yeah, I think it was a whirlwind. I think like everyone, it's just like you're spent on your feet 10 hours a day, and just like at the end of the day, like your voice is exhausted from having just such intense conversations. Yeah, I'd say I was privileged to be able to interview Zoltan Posnar in the Deep, and that was a really interesting conversation. Be able to pick his brain on some things, and we can kind of dig into that in a bit. But before we went on, well, I had an amazing sidebar chat with Zoltan and Eric Weinstein, and it was just going about physics and nuclear war, and just it was kind of a crazy thing that a serendipity of bringing people together in one place and be able to have sorts of conversations. He was impossible to have any other context. Got to meet RFK Jr. and Vivek, and yeah, it was just sort of fascinating to see a number of individuals all coming to one place and engaging around these issues.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Natalie?
Yeah, I mean, it was great putting faces to names that I've worked with quite a bit virtually over the past few years, and really having a lot of high bandwidth conversations, opportunities to meet people. I found it very valuable.
I mean, Natalie and I even had a great chat with Alex Bremer in the Deep too. That was a highlight for me too.
Alex Bremer, that guy's super smart. I had a conversation with him as well. So maybe we can go a little bit deeper. Was there one talk that you heard, or maybe product that you didn't know about, or piece of tech that you didn't know about before the conference that you walked away and you're excited about, or it got you thinking differently that you weren't thinking about before?
Yeah, I'd definitely say the ARC announcement was probably my biggest takeaway. It was initially announced at Bitcoin Plus in Austin, but it's basically an alternative to Lightning layer 2 scaling solution that seems to hold a lot of promise for preserving anonymity in transacting, and also requires a much lower on-chain footprint. So I can definitely imagine, things like that being used for specific use cases, and then building the bridges of interoperability between the various layer twos, depending on use case.
Yeah, for me, I had a fascinating conversation with Obi about Fedi and Fediments, kind of in keeping with the development of these other layer two protocols and ideas. Is really fascinating. It seems like a lot of work has been done in the past 12 months of folks kind of going into the workshop and thinking about the core tech and thinking about what they can build. And now we're sort of seeing some of the fruits of that come out. And I think the next 6-12 months will be very interesting as those start to actually be rolled out, implemented, and start to see potentially different flywheels being created. And when you see those things actually go live, oftentimes the results are not necessarily what you could predict. So I'm really excited to see what happens as those things start to scale up.
Yeah, I agree with both of those statements. I mean, the ARC announcement got me excited. I think people really focus on Lightning, and for good reason. It's got a lot of traction. It was kind of like the first mover of the second layer payment solution. But there's going to be more innovation. There's going to be competition. And so the ARC is just a perfect example of that. So I suggest people go check that out and read a little bit about it. And then Matt, I actually talked to Obi too, and he gets me just so excited about the future of Fediments. He was talking about kind of how the scaling of Ethereum is a little bit flawed because they basically have to scale by taking transaction volumes off the base layer, right? And they have to move it via whether that's rollups or sharding, and they need about like 95% of the trading volume off of on-chain for it to scale appropriately. And how Arbitrum, the trading volume there, actually surpassed Ethereum for the first time. And he said that's fundamentally flawed when you're thinking about a token. And why wouldn't you just use Arbitrum and not Ethereum? And how, when you're looking at Bitcoin scaling, like Fediments or Lightning, how it all kind of funnels down into that on-chain base layer. And that's how a more sustainable and robust way to scale the system at large, taking advantage of Bitcoin security and decentralization. So I talked to Obi at length, and I was really pumped when I talked to him. So I'm going to get him on the show. So I agree completely with you. Fediment, I'm extremely bullish about, and I suggest people check out ARC too. That's kind of, those two things are exactly what I was excited about too. So we agree on that. There was one difference between this conference, I would say, with conferences in the past, and we had 3 presidential candidates talking, giving keynote presentations at the conference itself, a Bitcoin conference. We had RFK Jr., we had Vivek, and we had Tulsi Gabbard all give keynote speeches for the first time, I think, at a Bitcoin conference. And so what's some of your takeaways from that? Because I think a lot of people have different views and how they feel about like presidential candidates talking about Bitcoin. Do they trust them? Are they for real? What did you think about what they said? I would love to hear your guys' thoughts.
Well, Natalie's the anthropologist, so I'll defer to her on maybe
Yeah.
What is like the cultural political economy of having, these sorts of emerging political candidates thinking that they can get a boost from Bitcoin?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, I think we're living in an era characterized by the collapse of trust in governing institutions. And so it makes sense that in every election we have waves of more insurrectionist candidates. I mean, we saw this going back to 2016 with Bernie and Trump. These are both outsider candidates who were, really viable contenders. I think since that time, we've seen a lot of realignment happen in the Republican Party around the insurrectionary candidate because he won. Whereas the Democratic Party has become the party of sort of institutionalism and a kind of centrist statism. And there's a big constituency for that. And so, I don't actually see Kennedy having any path to victory. He's not going to get his party's nomination. And that's really what needs to happen. But he's definitely shifting the Overton window, as is Gabbard. Vivek, I think, um, has some appeal within the Republican Party, but also doesn't have a path to nomination. So it's really more about shifting the discourse than it is about any of these candidates really being viable.
Yeah, like the takeaway I had is like the last, you could say 7-8 years have sort of taught me to like open the aperture of both political, but just in general, low probability, high consequence sort of events, and so I think this is interesting that expanding the Overton window is like a political concept, but in like sort of probability theory, it's like things coming in from the tails, right? And whether that's pandemics, sort of emerging, exponential phenomenon, like we sort of are accustomed to thinking there's like reversion to the mean, that that eventually things will sort of go back to the way things used to be. That the sort of almost like psychological desire, especially post pandemic, to like get back to normalcy. Has a strong constituency. But there's, I think, been a lot of other individuals, that Bitcoin is one example of, that are kind of want to like accelerate into change, right? And they have their own different visions of what that change should be. There's folks on the technology side in computing that think the sort of acceleration that we should be either, pushing forward or like aggressively trying to stop is on artificial intelligence. There's aggressive or there's a similar kind of say like impetus to see how we can have radical changes to the structure of the monetary system. And I think on the geopolitical stage, we're seeing like newly empowered actors try to revise the system of institutional and international arrangements, that have sort of structured the world over the past 75 years. So I see like these are all like, we live in a sort of a volatility machine. And I see political candidates represented by Vivek and RFK trying to sort of plug into that volatility machine and sort of try to catch the wave of some potential outlier political force that could sort of thrust them more close to the center of power. And I think that to me explains why, they would come to a Bitcoin conference, which like prima facie is, not obvious, right? Like, why would they think that going to a Bitcoin conference in Miami would be relevant to their political platforms, which are somewhat heterodox in lots of different ways? But they clearly felt the need to try to align, rhetorically at least, with some of the sort of ideological or sort of political valence of Bitcoin. And I think RFK's speech was somewhat landmark in having someone with a national political platform give essentially like a bill of rights for Bitcoin. I mean, some people have come and like pandered to Bitcoin and, kind of, said positive things about crypto in the past. And, Bitcoiners often, get a little bit over their skis and excitement about that. I think RFK's speech was a little bit different, at least from my perspective, in the sense that he went very specific and itemizing out like particular sort of platform planks on Bitcoin. Now, like every other politician, right? Like you have to watch words or watch actions, not words. But that was interesting. I wasn't expecting that level of detail and specificity from a candidate at that stage. But I agree with Natalie. Like, if I'm handicapping these chances, right, I still wouldn't make him the odds-on favorite in the 2024 presidential campaign. But crazy things have happened.
Yeah, I thought it was RFK Jr.'s speech was interesting because he brought up the Canadian truckers protest and how the censorship there is really what pointed him towards Bitcoin and why he sees it as a tool of freedom. And he says it aligns with American values, which is what Bitcoiners have talked about for many, many years now. And right now we have kind of on the opposite side, we have the politicians trying to push the Restrict Act, right? Trying to push it as a banned TikTok when really it would surveil pretty much all civilians using any kind of technological platform. And even this morning, we had Facebook get a record $1.3 billion fine from the European Union, privacy fine for giving data from EU citizens to American security services. And so I know that, Natalie, that you're kind of passionate about surveillance and digital privacy. So I was wondering if maybe you had any opinions on the Restrict Act or maybe some of this news we saw come out of Facebook this morning, if you heard about it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, the state is always in the process of amplifying its surveillance capabilities. So power does not cede power. Power agglomerates, accrues, collects more power. And so the expansion of warrantless surveillance that is de rigueur at this point will only continue. And not just in the United States, but in Europe. I mean, Europe is the sort of standard bearer at this point for fully AML KYCing everything. There's immense hostility to any kind of digital self-sovereignty coming out of Brussels. And so these fines are just political optics, sort of tit for tat that bear no meaning for the expansion of the surveillance state. The only, and the Restrict Act, the Data Act, the Antisocial CCP Act, these are all US security state attempts to give legal cover to export controls over software, which is something that, we've been fighting the government over since the 80s and 90s in the crypto wars. So it never ends. That's the thing. Society can never rest on its laurels, be confident that its victories have been won. It just continues.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that is what you're seeing is a competition on lots of different domains over control over networks, right? Like we live in a modern civilization is fundamentally driven by like network power, and there's different types of networks. Many of which are U.S. dominated and from which U.S. derives its geopolitical and economic and diplomatic power. But it's really through control over networks. And network power really comes in kind of two different flavors. There's sort of surveillance capabilities, like being able to monitor all the flows over a network. And to really do that effectively, it's about like routing all of the activity on the network through hubs that you can either monitor and or control. So this EU-US kind of data issue is a subset of this issue over cross-border data flows. And Facebook is just one example of many multinationals that just have global hubs of servers, and they take citizens' data from one jurisdiction and they analyze it in another jurisdiction. And a lot of nations and supranational blocks like the EU are trying to sort of put fire breaks around their citizens' data. One, to keep it out of the hands of maybe an adversary bloc or a nominal ally that may be surveilling your citizens, but also so that they can try to capture some of the economic value of that data themselves and not have it be exploited by, Meta as an example. So they can essentially try to use that as a building ground for their own national champions to use that data. So like networks are fundamentally about monitoring and surveillance, and that's about who controls the hubs. And these forces are basically trying to fracture those hubs, right? Try to pull hubs into different geopolitical regimes. But like a more aggressive use of network power is like choke point authority, right? And that's where you actually, break those flows or weaponize the fact that you sit at a hub. And so like we see this in the financial world. We have FinCEN, which is about essentially global surveillance of the financial networks using access to Bank Secrecy Act reports, suspicious activity reports, monitoring of SWIFT, et cetera. And then we have OFAC, which is like the choke point authority, right? We can levy, really coercive sanctions on entities in this global network that can be very effective because we control the hubs. And I think Natalie points to the expansion of that logic to other networks, especially computing networks. And so we're seeing this with things like the export controls on China on October 7th last year, where it was a blanket restriction on the sale of certain high-end chips to China, just full stop. China, though, has found other ways around it. For example, Chinese companies just paying for cloud service providers that have access to those chips and servers overseas, and they just pay for those cycles and then get the end result sent to them. And export controls don't really stop that. But what you really need then is a know your customer on computing. You need KYC for CSPs. So that CSP is just like a bank has to do KYC on their customers. You can imagine cloud service providers have to do KYC on who's renting, cloud compute. And that you can see this expansionist logic being driven by both geopolitical concerns over China's strategic competition, concerns that are sort of being maybe artificially pushed by certain incumbents on AI regulation, that we need to have like a very restrictive regulatory and surveillance regime on high-end GPUs is one example to mitigate the risks of, downside risks from AI. And so you're seeing this developing kind of logic drive the sort of push to apply this type of sort of network surveillance and choke point across other domains.
Yeah, so it really is about controlling the networks in this more, connected world that we live in today. And probably one of the most important networks is the SWIFT network that you mentioned, right? And so that's kind of what Zoltan has written about really last year or so. And you interviewed Zoltan. He's an analyst at Credit Suisse, very regarded by many in the investment community, as well as more so in the geopolitical realm of late, as he starts to write about this stuff. And he is an expert in financial plumbing, and so really understands the system. And he brings up in his piece titled "War and Currency Statecraft," he pontificates on a U.S. CBDC and why it wouldn't be a good idea in terms of like the power structures of this network. He talks about the Enbridge CBDC project and other competing currency kind of blocks between the BRICS and what they're trying to build to kind of compete with the SWIFT network. So that kind of plays into it as well, right? So you spoke with Zoltan, Matt, at the Bitcoin conference. Did you guys get into any of that, into what he thinks around those ideas, or maybe what was some of your highlights of your conversation with him? I'd love to hear more about it.
Yes, certainly. And I would love to hear Natalie's thoughts as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because this kind of gets into where the CBDC conversation from a political economy, but like meets the geopolitical kind of drivers of this as well. And yes, so I guess the bottom line for his thesis is that China is building financial plumbing to accomplish their strategic objectives. And just like in other domains, the way that they've tried to build their power has gone through like, three general phases. Essentially, it's block, then build, and then expand. So in the sort of military domain, especially in their, like close littoral waters, that sequence is followed. Block basically by investing in A2AD, anti-access, anti-area denial systems to basically prevent U.S. from like free reign in the close shores of China. So lots of sort of, big expansion of missiles. Then investing in more highly capable power projection capabilities to build their own endogenous military capabilities in the region, and then trying to expand by, putting in a few bases overseas. So in Djibouti, maybe in Africa. And so this is the logic they follow in the military domain. They carry this over into the financial domain. So the first is try to just block the ability of the West and the US specifically to geoeconomically coerce them so much, right? So one is just like build their own trade relationships. They're now like the single largest trading partner for the vast majority of the world, which has been a dramatic shift just in the past 20 years. And so it's fundamentally about trade. They are the center of manufacturing in the world system. So any country that wants to buy their stuff has to go through China. And then they're trying on that foundation of the strong bilateral trade, trying to expand their financial links and decreasing the ability of the West to coerce them through their dependency on dollar clearing. And so that's what the central bank digital currency systems that they're trying to promulgate standards for via things like Enbridge, which is essentially Hong Kong, Thailand, the UAE, and the People's Bank of China, as like a prototype cross-bridge CBDC project to do direct currency settlement or currency exchange and trade settlement without going through any existing status quo system. So not going through chips or using SWIFT as a messaging system. And that is their objective, so that they're not trying to first order expand the RMB as a global reserve currency. It's about building their own mechanisms that bypass, essentially, it's like a system bypass to the dollar system. So they just can't be easily choke pointed or surveilled. So those transactions just don't show up on a BSA. They're not on the FinCEN's radar. The U.S. States government has no direct insight into those transactions and has no control. Can't stop a transaction between, say, the Middle East or GCC countries and China. So that is their objective. And Sultan basically, from his plumber's perspective, is they're pretty close to having like the pipes that you would need to accomplish their strategic objectives for now, basically ready to go. That doesn't mean that they're ready to like replace the dollar, but it means that if we tried to break their access to the dollar clearing system, they would have sort of these alternative mechanisms pretty close to sort of go live if they needed to, and sort of flip more of the pipes, more of the flows through those pipes if they needed to. Now, would it be as efficient as their current role in the dollar system? By no means. But their main objective is essentially to defray the risk and therefore reduce the deterrent power of a sanctions threat on them, which is really one of their critical strategic objectives in the next 5 or 10 years. And yeah, the last point I'll say is like really technical thing he pointed to that I was not aware of is what this sort of system allows you to do is do foreign exchange trading really at the national level and sort of the state proxies, their national banks and other sovereign wealth funds without going through the dollar. And I think it was in 2016, 2017 was the first year that the Chinese yuan could be directly swapped with the Korean won without going through the dollar as an intermediary currency trading pair. And so the fact that like the dollar is like by far the most dominant trading pair in the foreign exchange market, which is like one of the largest markets full stop in the world, like several $1 trillion a year, a day of like daily turnover, means that if you can like de-dollarize foreign exchange swaps using these sorts of mechanisms, that can really sort of pretty dramatically undermine the liquidity in the foreign exchange market. And over time, like that is a way to kind of pull more liquidity into the RMB offshore market and gradually take it away from the dollar offshore market and make them less and then they don't have to go through any dollar mechanisms at all because it's just direct, X currency with CNY. And he was, he's paying a lot more attention to that phenomenon. It starts very small. It's kind of gradually then suddenly sort of thing, right? We're building those mechanisms, building those systems in place, and then liquidity can get more liquidity. But that is their vision for CBDCs is a strategic objective, really about their sort of geoeconomic imperatives, which is a very different perspective that I think we have in the West when it comes to CBDCs. And it's interesting to see those different perspectives. I'm sure Natalie has rich thoughts on that too.
Yeah. Natalie, if you wanted to jump in, by all means. I know that you looked at this a lot. And, Zoltan says, the last thing the Fed should do is go into CBDC development because that would hasten the demise of the hierarchy that they're in control of right now, and that they shouldn't fall into the trap of what he calls CBDC envy. But maybe you could talk about that, or you could talk about the Zen Bridge project, or kind of some of the thoughts that Matt just shared. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I mean, they're all herd animals, so they're going to do whatever their peer governments are doing, regardless of whether it's wise for them personally. There is no leadership at the federal level in the United States. The closest thing is a kind of reactivity to the threat of China, and that is not a strategy. It's not even a set of tactics. It's basically just a disposition. And nobody has a point of view on the rolling debt crisis that is sweeping the world. So Gladstein recently published a book on how the IMF and other multilaterals keep poor countries indebted. But China is much worse. I mean, the IMF and the World Bank, they tend to work with countries that are on the brink of default and negotiate terms or allow them to suspend interest payments or, create another loan to pay back that loan. China doesn't do that. China keeps all the terms secret. They actually have contractual obligations on borrowers to not disclose to other lenders how much they've borrowed from China. They have punitive interest rates, and they exercise virtually no leniency. And so there are like dozens of countries that are already defaulting on their loans to China, which comprise anywhere from a third to over half of their government debt. And they're going to default. So what we're on the brink of globally is a sovereign debt crisis of unprecedented proportions. And the world's largest debtor is actually the United States. And so the main, reactivity of U.S. leadership is first of all, like, how can we counter China and this ham-handed way. Second of all, how can we preserve the dominance of the dollar as both the global reserve asset and the global reserve currency? But that is out of their hands. That is not something that the US government has direct control over, whether they roll out a CBDC or not. And the moment that the market for treasuries begins drying up, which it already is, but there will be an inflection point. I don't know what that is, but at that point, the United States will flip into like debtor who can't pay their debts mode, and that is when countries are backed into that. That is when they do truly dangerous things. This is why we had a Second World War, because the Allies cornered Germany with punitive debt terms that they couldn't possibly repay. And you had a desperate, poor country that got as big as it possibly could. And so my concern actually is that in response to a looming default, the United States will start a war, a big one. And countries from around the world will join in. It will be another world war. And that is ultimately the path to clearing the ledger. You know, the last big ledger clearing we had in Western civilization was the Second World War. And if we don't have a debt policy, a policy of jubilee, a policy of debt forgiveness, not just for the United States, but for countries worldwide, then I think we're looking at a very dark, grim future.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we don't hope for that, but when you look at history of what happens when the debt gets to these levels, you know, hot wars do coincide with those times.
Yeah.
And so that's just the reality of it.
Well,
right?
and we've always
And then-
had hot wars. It's just that we have had the sort of dominant global position to be able to make sure those hot wars happened outside of the borders of the United States. So we were able to displace the warfare onto other countries. I'm not convinced that is going to hold for much longer.
Yeah, when you talk about the treasury market, you know, China used to, you know, take the proceeds from the trade and reinvest it into treasuries. They've stopped doing that, as many analysts like Luke Groman have pointed out for many years now, and they're reinvesting it into hard assets. And so it's like, who's going to buy those treasuries? And that's usually when the central bank and the Federal Reserve have to step in and start kind of monetizing that debt. And that's when things kind of get hairy. But, you know, just this morning, Joe Biden said that, you know, they're considering lifting sanctions with China, and that the tensions are going to, start to thaw between us. They're really positive about this. And so, Matt, when you're hearing comments like that, do you believe it at all? And where do you see the relationship between China and the United States moving from here?
Yeah, this is where everything really ultimately hinges, is how this bilateral relationship waxes and wanes, is really the fundamental risk driver for like everything else. and Natalie's, downside scenario is what is really at stake in that relationship. And you're right to point to some noises, positive tone shifts when it comes to just the very recent pattern of U.S.-China relationships. We had sanctions on the Ministry of Defense, Li Shangfu, that we may release so that he can meet with Secretary Austin at a forum coming up pretty soon. We had put those sanctions on him for, basically helping provide missiles and other support to North Korea and Iran, and potential support to Russia. So, and NSA National Security Advisor Sullivan had a call with Foreign Minister Wong, I think a few days ago, where they also had, constructive dialogue. I have been thinking, a lot of, analysts have been sort of looking at that and trying to assess out, like, where is this coming from, right? Because there's a political economy battle happening behind the scenes between different interests. If you've been sort of paying attention to a lot of, like, say, the more hawkish elements in sort of the DC security state blob, they have been I think on Natalie's register, like just preparing for an inevitable war and trying to sort of lay the groundwork for ratcheting up escalation across every domain with an eye towards basically just preparing for the inevitable, and try to get as many of our allies in place. All these technology, like the sort of decoupling talk, crash investments in the defense industrial base. All these war games about Taiwan scenarios being, that I've been asked to support on Fortune 100 boardrooms. Right, this is a topic of intense discourse at the most sort of the highest levels of kind of the Western sort of power structure. I think politically, though, I think what we're seeing potentially is like a tactical maybe pause, as some of the politicians may feel like there's a tail wagging the dog here, and they don't want this to get out ahead of them. And Biden may have realized that this flywheel may be getting too much out of control, and he's wanted to take this moment to pause. I mean, where they were in the relationship post October 7th controls was, we're going to slap you with the October 7th technology controls, but then we're going to have a Secretary of State Blinken go over there and try to smooth things over a bit to say, we're only narrowly applying these controls in this particular area, and we don't want this to like spill over and degrade the whole relationship. And then the balloon happened, and the balloon forced him to cancel the trip, and it just created like a lot more friction that I don't think was planned for strategically. So I think Biden politically has wanted to pull things back, but a lot of folks that really were egging the conflict on took advantage of that balloon thing to really try to like go hard in the paint. And so there's a battle going on, essentially the political economy in the U.S. system, over rationing things up versus trying to pull them back down. But there's this sort of strategic trend line that Natalie points to, which is like, this is a rising power that wants and has very, has pretty, broad ambitions to rewrite the rules-based liberal order, quote unquote, that they feel they're on the other side of, and then now have a legitimate sort of power base to sort of reset the terms of the global arrangement. And we are the status quo power, and we're going to aggressively resist that attempt. And the monetary dynamic is like a critical driver of that tension, that they are the net creditor, we're the net deficit. We're the net debtor, they're net surplus, we're the net deficit nation. And that has material consequences that I think a lot of people have pointed to, of like, oh, well, if we actually do get into a hot war, how are we actually going to fight it if we don't have the material capacity to produce the ships and the missiles and the weapons and the mobilization capacity, the lift capacity, the shipping capacity to bring those assets in theater? And I think there's a lot of skepticism among certain folks that if we try to fight the war that some folks want us to fight and we don't win it, that is like the worst possible scenario, right? So even if you get to reset the debt clock, but now the worst thing you can do is like precipitate a great power war and lose it. And when you think you're going to win, then you might want to go for it. But now I think there's some skepticism about like, is this an even odds sort of thing? Do we want to gamble like our world historical position on, on this or not? And those are kind of the stakes that I think we're going to see unfold in the next few years. And there's a lot of folks that, they don't want to happen on their watch. Like no politician wants to be the one to own that. Just like, the Fed doesn't want, Secretary Powell doesn't want to be the one who like, is the one that destroys the Fed's credibility. So there's always like the structural drivers, and then there's the political, like personal contingency that, history is replete with bad decisions just tipping us into catastrophic error. So yeah, I don't know. That was not leaving much with, I don't know if that's maybe like a hopeful gloss or a more pessimistic gloss. I don't know. That's to each their own how they read that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of interestingly. Yeah, Natalie, go on.
I think perhaps our best hope at not going to war in the near term, maybe a second Trump victory, which is devastating to say, but there are very few political candidates with any real shot at the presidency who are anti-war, whether out of principle or lack of care, laziness, whatever. And we've now begun to see in the historical record, some of the precedent for, what happens to presidents who challenge the war first national security state consensus. Nixon was targeted by the security apparatus, in part because of his rapprochement with China. And while Trump has taken a pretty hard stance against China on trade issues, he's also made very clear that he doesn't see the United States as being a forever war, being in the interest of the United States. And so I think we're in a really weird moment of political realignments and the Overton window shifting. We need to refound and rebuild American institutions, and we also need a new vision for America's role in the global world order. And this is why I've been advocating for a return to foreign policy driven by some of the earliest generations of American leaders, like John Quincy Adams, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, who saw foreign entanglements as the ultimate demise of the American Republic. And I think that thesis has played out.
Yeah, and how do you guys think Bitcoin fits into that, crazy environment that we're in right now of changing political structures and relationships, and at the same time you have this new digital money that's apolitical, right? And so all three of us were at the Bitcoin Policy Summit last month, educating policymakers and legislators about Bitcoin. Do you think Bitcoin could play a role in helping kind of stop some of this from happening, or at least delay it or prevent it? Or, maybe if the US could help bolster it, maybe we could help heal some of these relationships by moving to a more monetary system that's apolitical in nature, where you don't have these kind of trading dynamics and other things going on. What do you guys think about Bitcoin's role here?
Yeah, I mean that's like a several 100,000 word question answer required.
Yeah.
I would start if I'm assigning odds to the extent that this decade Bitcoin has a material chance of mitigating these existing structural and strategic frictions. It's like an outside force, right? It's not going to be, I think, a determining factor, in at least again as far as I can see to the opaque future. Fundamentally, these are big countries with lots of armies and trillions of dollars on the line and nuclear missiles, and Bitcoin is emerging into that, and it's now potentially playing more of a global macro role. And I think it's more interesting in kind of if we avoid a war, right? So avoid the worst scenario. Then we're in a world of a weird, messy Cold War 2.0, sort of, but a very different type of Cold War 2.0, where the global system there was entirely split. And this is a system of networks that are really overlapping, and it's trying to compete over network influence. And I think where the West is really, on the downslope when it comes to, say, demographics and debt, but we still kind of have, network power and technology power. Where we're going to look for are where the raw inputs to that come from, which is unfortunately the global South. And the way we prosecuted the global South in the past, and these Cold War 1.0, was through things like death squads, and each side essentially doing horrible things to try to fight in the emerging markets in the developing world, to the extreme misfortune of those populations. So one maybe hopeful opportunity that could be presented by Bitcoin is you can sort of fight Cold War 2.0 without going down that sort of very unsavory path, and actually let these open source, opt-in, voluntary sorts of technologies bring these populations into a networked global technological society, with more guarantees on autonomy and individual liberty and ownership of their own assets, and powers of expression, which has historically been denied to those billions. That's I think a hopeful vision of where, if we're going to be entering a world where strategic powers are going to go at it, that tends to centralize, that tends to lead to more sort of authoritarian impulses to try to coordinate all the economic statecraft in order to beat your opponent. That tends to sort of undermine net sort of democratic individual autonomy. So the extent that Bitcoin can sort of succeed, not just in the United States, but around the world, acts as potentially a mitigating buffer for those impulses. But that's maybe a hope. I'm not sure if it's a prediction.
Gotcha.
Well, what we've seen historically, I mean, if you look at sort of the arc of world history, civilizations tend to go through higher trust periods that are characterized by a proliferation of credit-based money, and lower trust periods that are characterized by a proliferation of commodity money. And so the first sort of instances of coinage tended to coincide with time periods characterized by rampant warfare. So whether we're talking about the Warring States period in China, or the similar time period in Greece, or in the on the Indian subcontinent, these were where the first coins were minted. These are also the civilizations that in this time period generated the major world religions that are still with us today, and the first instances of coinage. And so I actually see us as in the midst of a new axial age for humanity, characterized in part by the appearance of the first non-state commodity money, verifiably scarce, global, internet native. But I mean, the 20th century was the bloodiest century in all of human history. If we're not careful, the 21st century will shape up to be even worse. And so we need to think about the institution building that is required of us right now, in our country, in the United States, that can begin shifting us from a low trust society to a high trust society. It's not a panacea. It's not going to change the world. We need to stop focusing on trying to control the world. The world is going to do what the world is going to do. We as Americans have a responsibility to focus on our country, because it's from our country that either civil war or new nation will be born. It's from our country that we will decide to foment or accelerate another global war. We have to take self-responsibility. And I believe that is actually the ethos of Bitcoin. And so I have some hope, but it is a highly contingent hope.
Well said. Really well said. Bitcoin is hope. That's the meme, right? And it does kind of bring out personal accountability and responsibility in a way. So I totally hear that. And so that was really well said. Last thing I wanted to talk about was kind of the banking crisis that we've seen recently in the last couple of months. Seen really a concentration of the banking sector as smaller and medium-sized banks struggle, losing deposits to these larger banks who either had better risk management strategies or simply benefit from the regulators coming in and backstopping them because they're deemed too big to fail. And so why would the depositors stay at these riskier, smaller institutions? They're fleeing them for these larger institutions that are more likely to be backstopped by the FDIC and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. And so, Matt, I thought it was really interesting what you said, and you kind of talked about how it's moving to a more national security MMT situation, whereas politically things are starting to get a little bit more hairy, like all the things we just talked about between China and the USA. The monetary system, having a controllable banking system, is becoming a national security kind of issue. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because I just thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, I mean, the larger premise or the subtext of the conversation with Zoltan was like, money is geopolitical, right? And there was actually a recent story that came out yesterday. I think there'll be a series of this looking back at essentially like remember like the LIBOR fixing scandal that happened in the immediate crisis. Well, some journalists have gotten hold of all of the communications in a lot of the senior British banks at the time, and the story is very clear. Basically, the British government and the Bank of England were like directing and coordinating and basically forcing all of the banks that were setting LIBOR rates to sort of artificially set them lower in a moment of crisis, right? And that there's sort of implications that this may not have been a Bank of England thing. It may have been, at least a wink and a nod, or if not a nudge or arm twisting from the other side of the pond. Which is one example of where when push comes to shove, right? Like the sovereign's going to sovereign, right? The hegemon's going to hegemon. And in normal free market, benign trading conditions, they step behind the curtain and they let things play out. But when crisis is a brewing, politics and geopolitics supervenes on the free market. Just like that's just the way that it works. And Natalie can give you the thousands of years of human anthropology that shows this. And so this is like another moment where we're seeing, that type of phenomenon play out, but I think on a much more structural scale, not in like the firefighting mode that was 2008, but on like we're entering a new regime globally. And the West has to sort of reset the formal and institutional arrangements between private capital and state power fundamentally. And now importantly, like technology is like interlinked. So you have sort of high finance, big tech, emerging tech, Silicon Valley, and state power, all trying to accommodate themselves to a different dynamic now. And the state is trying to put themselves in the pole position with sort of, as I said, national security MMT, right? Where the state's geopolitical and strategic prerogatives are going to come first, and that means whether it's soft or hard capital controls, financial repression, administrative credit, versions of soft yield curve control, but are done in a much more, I'd say, subtle a manner as much as they possibly can, is what you should expect, right? And I think Zoltan even pointed at this is like, he expects things like the bank term funding program. As it's a soft form of yield curve control, right? It's a way of essentially trying to relieve the private sector of these illiquid securities that the government in themselves made illiquid and upside down on those banks' balance sheets. But they have to do this in a way that preserves the ability of the government to keep a stable financing regime for itself. So the natural forces of this mean they need a more centralized, controllable banking system and an overall capital market. And so I think that like the bank term funding program and like know your customer and export controls on high technology, these are all different sort of symptoms of this underlying trend, which is like we just cannot have the free flow of capital. Global finance cannot just be allowed to sort of run amok and have Eurodollar and London interbank financing. We're going to have SOFR and repo markets that are sort of more directly tunable from DC. Outbound investment screening, you're not going to be able to invest in China. Certain technologies are going to be increasingly subject of regulatory scrutiny, and that's just like the baseline expectation. If as crisis or anxiety geopolitically increases, you should expect like a concomitant increase in say the overtness and maybe the heavy-handedness of those controls. And like the end game of that is what we saw post World War II, where there just is no free market for government debt. It's just a government to government thing, right? It is just fixing rates across the curve. The last thing though that I wish I would have asked Zoltan this part, but I didn't think about it later, is that this gets wonky more in the shape of the yield curve, but if there's like a single like graph that sort of charts this, it's like the shape of the yield curve to a certain extent. And right now, the yield curve essentially is almost like flat, but like inverted, right? But Zoltan's point is like they need to do the exact opposite, right? In a yield curve regime like we had in the post World War II era, it was capped, but it was capped in a positively sloping manner. Right now, we seem to be capped in like a negatively sloping manner, which is like very bad news. And so like that's I think the pickle that they're in, right? And I think the attempts at national security MMT would be to like selectively like relieve that for parts of the economy that are geopolitically critical, right? So like the defense industrial base, aerospace and defense, and then politically connected circles that can, whine for bailouts. But that's where we're heading.
Natalie, any thoughts around the concentration of the banking system or this banking crisis in general?
Yeah, I mean the consolidation of bank and state is on its way. It's accelerating, and so I mean again the question is, will there be any meaningful difference between the political economy of the United States and the political economy of any other country? For all of our vitriol against China, what's the difference? Like, what exactly is it that we propose is the value proposition for capital, for entrepreneurs, for citizens, for just people to live here? That question has to be answered, and it can only be answered politically.
Yeah, I mean that's a perfect point, and I think it's sometimes underexpressed how like we seem to be emulating our adversary as a sort of a means of trying to prosecute the strategic competition, but in doing so, we're sort of undermining the one thing that gave us at least an implicit advantage in the competition, right? Is that we were beholden not just to the logic of hard power and material interest, but that we represented quote unquote the shining city on the hill, which has always been propaganda. It's always been like an ideological kind of superstructure, but it has been manifested in American civic society, right? We actually have had maybe imperfect but functioning democratic institutions for periods of time, and those have been the things that have been sort of the course correcting mechanisms in our society. If the pendulum swings too far, right, we have ways of at least averting the disasters that other systems of government have fallen into when they have a total authoritarian totalitarian system and there's no checks on the leader going to a catastrophic war, for example. And so that is a concern I think I have in general, is just are we heading down that path where every step along the way is justified, it has like a clear technocratic and security logic, but the end result is we're sort of eating the seed corn of democracy along the way. And yeah, maybe Bitcoin is there as like an interesting alternative check. It's like, hey, you can actually, like, there's a functioning system over here that doesn't require that same logic to function. And maybe it's actually like aligned with that embedded ethos that Natalie pointed to, that sometimes gets obscured when you're just trying to prepare for the next war.
Well, that would certainly differentiate the United States. China bans Bitcoin, and then we embrace it. And I think that's such a great point. What differentiates us today to China when you look at all these policies that they're pushing forward, and it's hard to kind of see a difference sometimes. And what made us special? It's freedom, it's preservation of property rights, things like that. And so I think Bitcoin definitely aligns with those values. And that's the narratives you hear with the CBDC proponents in the United States as well. Oh, we're going to fall behind to China. We have to do it. China's doing it. But no, why do we want to mimic what China does? We're the United States of America. So I think that's an excellent point. So maybe I want to throw it to you guys. Like, we're out of time, but you guys always point me towards like the bigger picture of how to think about things, whether that's from a historical perspective, geopolitical perspective. So I want to thank you guys for coming on the show. Maybe let people know where they can find you. And if you just have any closing thoughts about anything we discussed today, feel free to take a minute or two. Let's throw it to Natalie and then Matt.
Sure. There's no substitute for judgment. Matt referred to the sort of technocratic logics that take on their own momentum. If nobody's standing back and asking not just what our strategy is, but what is the why behind our strategy, then we will get ourselves and many other people into a world of hurt. So what is leadership? Leadership is the ability to step back, to extricate yourself from the momentum that is underway, and to continually ask if you're going where you actually intend to go. And that is the question we have to ask ourselves as a country.
Follow Natalie.
Yeah, maybe Natalie for president. How about that?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, that's something that's sometimes been, if not sorely lacking in our political discourse, is just a reckoning, right? And honestly, we're facing a moment of sort of strategic crux points, very very shortly. And like good leadership is telling the American people like these are our forks in the road. These are the honest trade-offs that we have to reckon with. We can't just like run the credit card machine and like live fat and happy like we've been for the past 30 years. Like there are hard material trade-offs, and we want to like use that moment to like reassess strategically and ethically what our position is and how we want to participate in a much more democratic process. So I would endorse that and Natalie for president 2024. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, give both these people a follow. They're both fellows at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, as well as they do other work. They're both on Twitter. Maybe what's your guys' handles? Just real quick, shout them out for people if they want to follow you guys. I highly recommend it.
At N Smolenski.
At Matthew_Pines.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on Swan Signal. Really appreciate it. I always enjoy talking to you both. And have a wonderful day.
If you care about your financial future, you need to check out a couple of our offerings, including Swan IRA and Swan Private. Swan Private is our white glove concierge service where you get a trusted partner on your Bitcoin journey. We offer all kinds of education and research projects, as well as exclusive events to our Swan Private customers. Check it out today at swan.com/private. Also, Swan IRA. Swan IRA is the best way to gain exposure to real Bitcoin in a tax-advantaged account, like a traditional IRA, a Roth IRA, or rolling over your 401k. So if that interests you, check it out at swan.com/IRA today.